With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome to Heard Tell. Okay, let's go back overseas, talk a little bit of some really interesting stuff going on in the UK that, yes, it's a little different, but there's some universal principles to apply there. Got Jack Rowlett back with us, Young Voices contributor. He's a writer and commentator coming to us from Nottingham, England, of Robin Hood fame. How are you, sir?
I'm good, thank you. It's good to be here. Looking forward to discussing Britain.
Yeah, I am too. So you got to mess with the NHS National Health System going over there right now. Everything from ambulance response times, you got nurses strikes. Now you've got a doctor's shortage. This looks like a real big hot mess on the outside, but the real problem with this is the more you look at it, doesn't look like there's a lot of solutions coming anytime soon on some of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's top of the political agenda here at the moment. And something that's interesting is in this country, we sort of look down our noses at America. You guys as having, you don't have universal healthcare, and your healthcare outcomes are determined often by whether you've got a job, how much money you have, and we sort of get this. We have this real sense of superiority in Britain that we have this free at the point of use healthcare, and everybody has access to it. But actually, now increasingly, because of the state of the healthcare system, I don't think we can really claim to be a country with universal healthcare anymore. I've been in accident and emergency in Nottingham recently, and you've got people on beds in corridors, you've got people sleeping on the floors, you've got, wait times of days now in some cases for accident and emergency care. And we've got I think it's about 500 people a week currently dying purely because of the extended wait times for accessing care. And in terms of the solutions, I think there are a couple of problems here. One of which is that it sort of has to get worse before it gets better. And so I think that's the dynamic of us feeling like we can't really make it better, like there's no solutions to the problem, because actually there's nothing that's going to make it better tomorrow. But there are a number of things that we can do reasonably quickly. So one thing that's being talked about a lot over here is that we could allow pharmacies to prescribe medication, because they're not allowed to do that. So for kind of less serious illnesses, you would be able to go to your pharmacy rather than your doctor and get a prescription for some medication from them. And that's we've got a big problem with wait times for doctor's appointments as well, so that would help out with that as well. And then other solutions, like the fact that the NHS model really focuses on acute care, and it doesn't focus enough on making sure people are fit and healthy in general, and so preventative care. And so there's a lot of talk about how we really need to transition to focusing on that sort of care as well, because then you avoid this sort of crisis happening in the first place if you have a fitter, healthier population.
Yeah, Jack Rowlett joining us. Let's have the grown folk talk about this, though, is because too much when you're talking policy-wise, like when we're talking on a show like this or we're writing a piece, some of our friends use universal healthcare or government healthcare or single payer, whatever terminology you want to use, almost like it's a magic word, like, oh, we'll just have universal healthcare and it fixes everything. Whatever system you're advocating for, if it's not well administered, it really doesn't matter, because you're still going to have problems with it. And that's where this thing kind of falls apart, is like, look, it's not a magical incantation. If you're going to have universal health care, there are trade-offs to it. You're going to pay much higher taxes. You're going to have limited options on your health care. You're going to have those trade-offs, but it is free and everybody gets it. We just don't want to have those full discussions past the buzzwords sometimes. Like you just said, you've said it for so long. Well, we have universal health care. You don't. This is the risk of it in inertia. If you don't administer it, it really doesn't matter, does it?
Yeah, I mean, if it's free but terrible, then there's not much point in having it at all. And ultimately, somebody does have to pay. And that's the sort of difference is ultimately care in America is rationed just as it is here. It's just here it's being rationed at random in a healthcare system that's sort of crumbling all around us, whereas in America it's more rationed on the basis of your income or your job, right? And here there is a real, we often say in the UK that the NHS is the closest thing we have to a national religion. Like that's the sort of cult-like status it has in the national psyche. And for a long time, any talk of reforming it at all immediately leads to suggestions that you want to replace it with an American style system and that you want to privatize it and you're going to sell off the NHS to private American pharmaceutical and medical companies. And so there are all these roadblocks to reform. And it's a lot of it is driven by the politicians, because as soon as you have one party say, okay, well, the NHS is a mess, we need to reform it, let's do A, B, and C, the other parties come along and say, no, you want to privatize the NHS, they're going to destroy it. If you want to save the NHS, you've got to vote for us at the next election. And so nothing ever changes. But I think right now, the scale of it is just unimaginable. I don't think people really imagined that we'd reach a point in this country where you are ringing 999 for an ambulance and potentially it just doesn't come and you end up dying in your home, or your loved one ends up dying. And so I think now there is something of a changing attitude, and people are acknowledging that maybe we do need a change to our healthcare system, and that maybe even I think our attachment to universal healthcare is resolute, but that maybe this model of universal healthcare just doesn't work with the aging population we have.
Jack Rowlett joining us. See, this is the problem in healthcare in America: is the older you get, the more expensive you get. We're talking about the business side of it now. The older you get, the more expensive you get. And we have an insurance-heavy model for good, bad, or indifferent. So, the young people have to pay into it, although they're not using as many services, broadly speaking, to take care of the older people. That's the problem. You already mentioned it. For folks that aren't familiar with the national health system, it was built, it's a post-World War II thing heavily. That's kind of the model. It was designed for that Britain, because that was the Britain that existed then, the UK more broadly. That's not the UK that exists now. There is the talk that it didn't keep up to the times as it was supposed to, that focused on acute care, not focused on things like preventative care or long-term care or even palliative care for the elderly. That's where you start getting into the nuts and bolts medical policy problems here. And that's where a lot of the debate is, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's been flawed since the start, because you mentioned it's a post-war model of healthcare. It's absolutely right. It was started in the late 1940s, but actually the expectation of the government that brought it in was you would cut healthcare spending in the medium and long run as a result of bringing in universal healthcare, because you'd treat people and so their conditions wouldn't get worse. But actually what happened was the sheer scale of demand meant that actually healthcare spending has just risen inexorably since then. And we've reached a tipping point now because of those sort of demographic issues. We've got so many people sort of over the age of 60 and not enough young people paying taxes in. And we've also, we're rolling up the drawbridge and not letting as many immigrants into Britain anymore. So that tax base is shrinking. And so demand on the NHS is just increasing inexorably as that tax base shrinks. And no one has thus far been willing to reckon with this difficult problem and actually explain to the public, well, okay, you've got the options of either we carry out a massive reform, either everyone just goes private and poor people no longer have access to healthcare, or people pay a lot more in taxation. And these reforms and ideas aren't always popular here, because it's really hard to reform the NHS because of its place in the national psyche. But actually it's so urgent now. It's so urgent. You've got, toddlers sleeping on floors in accident and emergency departments. You've got pensioners waiting 4 days, pensioners with suspected heart attacks, waiting days for healthcare, dying on trolleys, people in car parks here receiving care in car parks because there's no capacity inside the actual hospitals themselves. We just need to do something about it and reckon with the difficult truth.
Yeah, Jack Rowlett joining us on Heard Tell. When we have these conversations, I always put my hands up and I was like, okay, I'll have the universal healthcare versus whatever debate with anybody you want to. I want to tell everybody two things about me, though. I lived overseas. I lived in Germany. I've been a German patient in the hospital. I've had a German ambulance pick me up. I know how that kind of model, the European model, works intimately. I've been there. I'm also a VA health patient, Veterans Affairs patient, which is the government-run healthcare system in America. So I know the good, bad, and indifference of all of this. If you live in Germany, you get excellent healthcare. But what we would call the middle class in America, you're also paying in the 40 percentile of taxes plus a 19% VAT tax to pay for all that. If you pitched America on 60% taxes, they would tar and feather you and run you out of town. You just mentioned it with the UK. There's no model of reform for the NHS that isn't involving raising taxes, but you've got a population problem at the same time. That's a math problem that has got to be solved if you're going to actually fix the NHS, right? And that brings in immigration, it brings in politics, it brings in the culture war stuff. That's an ugly ball to try to unwind. But the result of that is an NHS where it's really hurting people.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And one thing people don't seem to often grasp about Britain is actually our healthcare system. It's not a straight European model. It's free at the point of use, and it's universal. So I think in America you often associate that with Europe, but actually it's quite different to how the rest of Europe works. We don't have any real insurance model at all, whereas countries like Germany and the Netherlands, for example, they do. It's a much more heavily regulated insurance model than you have in America, but there is a sort of social insurance system there. And so in a sense, we have the worst of all worlds with our healthcare system, because it's massive and bureaucratic and run by the states, and you have all the problems that go along with that, but also the quality of care and provision of care is really bad as well. So it's a massive problem. And the demographics that you've just mentioned, I mean, that is the biggest thing now. And actually it does go broader than the NHS. You mentioned immigration and the cultural stuff and everything. There is a real generational divide here in the UK now. And actually part of improving public services, so the NHS, education, all those things, part of that is making tough choices about letting more immigrants in and encouraging people to have more children, and making policy more pro-family, because that's how you increase the size of the tax base in the short and medium term, and that's how you fund good public services. And what's most interesting is that the very people who rely most on the National Health Service, the sort of over 60s, over 65s, those people are the most unwilling to confront those difficult choices and make Britain a more pro-family country and make Britain a more pro-immigrant country. And it's a cycle of despair.
Yeah, Jack Rowlett, we have the same problem here with what we call the boomer generation. But we'll get into that some other time. Let's talk about that right there, though, because this is where this starts to cross streams into some other areas of policy. That young cohort, let's just say 18 to 25, post-school, post-university, that group, we're seeing some very troubling data post-COVID coming out of the UK. They're having trouble getting jobs, and they're having trouble getting housing. You talked about the immigration problem. Look, it's an either or formula. You either have a high birth rate or you got to have immigrants if you're going to have an economy. You got to have one or the other. The people you do have can't get work and can't get housing to start their own lives and start their own, housing is equity. Housing is wealth. These are building blocks to your economy that we don't talk about as much as we do, like the unemployment rate. This is really troubling stuff for the UK, though, because the building blocks of the future economy for the next generation don't look real good right now.
No, they look terrible. And if I look at people my age who are looking to get on in life, smart people my age, all of them are looking at leaving Britain because they don't think that there are opportunities here, and they don't think the country is serious about improving things. Housing is a real barrier. The state of housing in the UK right now is a disaster on so many levels. You have the level that it's really hard to buy for first-time buyers. The cost of housing relative to average wages is it's about 9.5 times higher, the average house price, compared to the average annual wage. And in London, it's something like 20 times higher. It's ridiculous there. And if you go back to the 1970s, it was about 3 times the average annual wage. So objectively, in real terms, the cost of housing has gotten so much more expensive over the past half century or so. And then also that's now spilling over into the rental sector. So for a long time, you've had a situation where younger people, people in their 20s and 30s have struggled to afford housing, but there was plenty of rented accommodation that they could find and stay in. And it's not desirable for people to be relying on that forever, but actually at least you had somewhere you could go. Now we're in a situation where there's such a dire shortage of rented accommodation in lots of our cities, particularly university cities. We have students coming into cities, and there's waiting lists for accommodation. There's queues all the way around the block to look around apartments. You have situations where landlords are actually renting apartments to the highest bidder, as in the person who can pay the most rent per month, rather than having a predetermined set amount. And when you actually get into this accommodation, a lot of it is really run down. It's really bad. It's damp, it's moldy, it's cold. And so the quality of housing is really low. And because there's such a shortage, it means although we have laws around kind of minimum provisions that you have to have for accommodation in the UK, actually your power as a renter is minimal, because you can go to your landlord and complain about something, and the landlord's response will often be, well, okay, move out then. But you know you can't go anywhere else because there's nowhere else in your price range. You see your friends who are having to move back in with their parents because they can't even rent somewhere. Not that they can't even buy somewhere, they can't even rent somewhere. That's how bad it's gotten. And then that spills over into this intergenerational problem, in that you have boomers here who own all the property essentially, and they block new property from being built, particularly in the places we most need it. And so again, that cycle of despair, it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. That leads to less children being born, it leads to lower productivity, it leads to lower tax take, and that makes public services worse, and it makes Britain a less dynamic and versatile economy.
Yeah, Jack Rowlett joining us. The reason I bring that up is because you said Britain is under a generational change. Generational change comes whether you want it to or not, right? There's no stopping it. That's the tide of time when it comes to people. Generational change can be good or it can be bad. We're looking at these economic problems. We're looking at the NHS problems. We're looking at the political upheaval in Parliament right now in the UK. It doesn't look like this is going to be good generational change if you don't solve some of these problems. You have an urban and rural problem. The highest unemployment for the youth is in the West Midlands, the Birmingham, the old industrial sectors. It seems like there needs to be some pretty bold action here to cut off this whole generation going in a bad generational change instead of good generational change. But is there any movement to try to actually do anything about it?
There's lots of grassroots campaigns, but at the top of politics, nothing is changing. I mean, our government has just made it harder, in effect, to build housing by abolishing housing targets that were placed on local authorities here, which means there's even less incentive for local councils here to build housing than there was before. And we already weren't building enough. Taxes here have been risen to the high. They're now at the highest level they've been since the Second World War. And if you look at where the tax burden falls, it's on working people and working young people, and not on older people. And so money is increasingly being given out to older people in the form of benefits from the state. And it's money from younger people that's funding that, except that the kind of the usual dynamics of history have been reversed. If you go back sort of 40 years, older people were tended to be in poverty at a much higher rate than the working age population. Now it's reversed. We have more than a third of pensioners here are millionaires, and the percentage of pensioners, retirees in poverty, is considerably lower than the working age population now. And so things are being constantly rigged in their favor. We have here what we're dubbing the cost of living crisis now, because the cost of energy is so high. And one of the things that the government's doing to help out with that is they're giving out payments direct to households, like a sort of amount taken off the bill of your energy, and yet more money just goes to pensioners for that handout than anyone else. And it's not means tested at all, whether you're a rich pensioner or a poor pensioner. If you're old, you get a big handout from the state to help you with your energy. If you're a young person on a 0 hours contract with a load of college debt who's struggling to pay their soaring rent, you get a lot less. And so the problem for the government is their voter base is almost entirely the over 65s now. So there's no political impetus for them to make things better for younger working age people.
Yeah, Jack Rowlett, that's a universal problem. Every country has that problem. The older people are going to have more political power because they got more money, more assets, whatever. That's not new. However, you do have one advantage in England where you have a parliamentary system with, outside some very specific judicial review, what Parliament says goes. You don't have a written constitution, so whatever Parliament does, that goes. You could have some pretty sweeping change here if there was a political appetite for it. How much has the chaos of the last year or so really crippled people's belief in Parliament? And I'm not just talking Labour versus the Tories and that sort of stuff, just the chaos in general. That's where it really starts kind of hurting, is because where you would look to Parliament like, okay, it's time to do some sweeping change here. And you're changing prime ministers every 5 minutes, and you're just kind of sitting around waiting for the Labour to get their turn. And you're probably not real super hyped that the Labour's going to do a whole lot. That's a big problem of faith in government you've got when you really, really need them to be able to steady the ship, right?
Yeah, I mean, the system's totally breaking down now. And if you look historically, when one party gets tired, there's tended to be a politician from the other party who is a kind of radical, dynamic leader who people can get excited about and get behind. And actually, if you talk to people in the UK now, no one feels excited about any of them. You know, they're all terrible. They're all, or not terrible necessarily, but there's just a kind of apathy, right? You either hate politics or you just feel apathetic towards it here. And people look towards Parliament, and they look at, we've had scandals involving expenses, we've had scandals involving drugs recently, we've had scandals involving sexual harassment in Westminster, and people just look at them as sort of reflecting the worst of Britain rather than the best of Britain. And so, yeah, I think people's faith in our politicians to actually get us out of this rut is very low right now.
Yeah, I had a Labour friend quip to me, like, if all due respect to Keir Starmer, he said, you know, if we had a Labour leader worth anything, he'd be king instead of Charles after 3, you know, conservative prime ministers having to resign in disgrace. Just, you know, it's stuff like that. Like, nobody seems to be able to even capitalize on the other side not being able to do anything. That's kind of, I'm an outside observer. You tell me, you're there. But when you can't take advantage of your political opponents absolutely shooting themselves in the foot, I don't inspire a whole lot of confidence to me. I'm not picking a side. I'm just saying it looks bad. It looks chaotic. And it looks like even when this, you know, whenever you do have a general election this year, this fall, whenever that eventually happens, if Labour takes over, I don't really see anything really changing.
Yeah, I mean, it should be stated that Labour are well ahead in the polls here at the moment. And Keir Starmer, for an opposition leader, is pretty popular. But there's that lack of enthusiasm. People are just kind of trundling along saying, well, it's time for a change now. Conservatives have been really bad. Labour can't be any worse. There's no enthusiasm whatsoever. But I think one interesting dynamic as well is that actually the last time Labour came into power, they did so on the back of a really strong economy. And so when they came in, there was lots of money to throw around on public services. There was lots of money to sort of improve things for lower earners, lots of money to spend on tax credits, child benefit, all these sorts of things. When Labour inevitably, I think, win the next general election, whenever that is, and it has to be before January 2025, we're going to have just come out of a quite long and deep, and relatively shallow recession on the back of a decade of really stagnant economic growth. And so there's just not going to be money to change anything. I think we're looking at a wasted decade for Britain, really, now. In the 2010s, it was really cheap to borrow, and we chose to cut capital spending. We chose not to build more housing. We chose not to confront climate change. We chose not to confront our generational crisis and the pressure that puts on public services. And now we're in the next decade, a decade of high inflation, of higher interest rates, of real downward pressure on growth. And we're sort of left with very few options but to sort of try and push forward and make things better in the 2030s. It really feels like there's no real change that you could make really soon that would improve things, because there's no money and there's so many structural problems in the UK now.
Jack Rowlett joining us. That sounds bleak. For those of us, look, we got our own mess in America. I'm not going to pretend like we don't, especially with what's going on in Congress right now. And we're in a presidential election cycle for 2024 ourselves. So we will share some guffaws if you want to send them our way, to be fair. What does and doesn't break through media, especially across the pond here? What's a few things for us, maybe the international audience, the American audience, or even the British audience? What should we be watching for beyond the headlines, beyond just PMQs, beyond just the nurses' strikes and the rail strikes? What's a couple things we should be watching for as this year starts to unfold? Is it maybe having the election early? Is it maybe a new leader rising up through the ranks? What are you watching for that we should be watching in the headlines underneath all the noise?
I think what's really interesting at the moment is Brexit, which has been out of the news for a couple of years now since we left the European Union. But what's really interesting now is people are turning against it here. We sort of have nearly 60% of the population saying that it was a mistake to leave the European Union, and only around a quarter of the population saying that they think Brexit's going great. And we know from sort of trade figures that we're one of the only countries, one of the only major economies where our levels of international trade haven't recovered from before the pandemic. And it's been long enough since we came out of COVID lockdowns now that we can sort of say that might have something to do with Brexit. We've got problems at the borders. We've got problems in Northern Ireland. You know, the Northern Irish Protocol still isn't sorted out. And I think for a long time, the kind of Brexit wars was like an aspect of the culture wars, and it was a real 50-50 split. Now it feels like people are decisively turning away from Brexit, or certainly this hard, detached view of Brexit, and are actually more in favor of a closer relationship with Europe. And I think that will have an interesting effect on politics, because the Conservatives have massively tied themselves to the strongest, hardest form of Brexit possible. But Labour have also kind of become a party of Brexit as well since the last general election. They're saying, well, we're not going to join the EU. We just want to make Brexit work. We don't want to get that much closer to Europe. And so I think that's the interesting dynamic, is what effect will that have on British politics as that stops being, as the kind of the 50-50 divide between Remainers and Leavers here stops being a thing. And instead, people increasingly are not necessarily wanting to rejoin the EU, but are really dissatisfied with how Brexit has turned out.
Yeah, Jack Rowlett joining us. Let's be adults here, though. That sentiment and undoing Brexit after the decade of getting to Brexit, that's two very different things. And plus, that's not up to just the UK anymore. We saw what the EU did since Britain and the UK has left. They're not exactly going to gift wrap a basket full of provisions for you to come back either. That could be even worse of a situation. There's a lot of mess there if they ever decide to try to go back down that hallway again. I wonder how much taste there would be for that if they actually tried to do it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big barriers, is that I mean, if I were the EU, I wouldn't really want us back at this point. And I don't think there's much suggestion that we'd go in to Europe.
Oh, they
again.
want you back, but they're going to want you on your knees crawling back.
Yeah, well,
and economically, everything's going to be 70-30 their way, which I'm not sure that really fixes anything for the UK. I'm just being real about it. Like, if I was them, I'd do it too. It's like, sure, we'll have you back, but everything's going to be in our favor this time.
Yeah, and they'd want us to join the Euro and possibly Schengen as well. So we would lose a lot of the advantages we had last time we remembered the EU. But what I think could happen is there could be a move towards sort of a form of associate membership. So trying to join the single market. So rather than going back into the EU, just having a closer relationship with Europe's institutions. Again, the terms that Europe might demand from us if we tried to do that might be too high a price to pay. But I think there is an increasing sort of understanding in Britain that maybe either Brexit was a mistake or we've just messed Brexit up really badly. I think that's increasingly becoming the consensus here.
Yeah, interesting times we live in, my friend, for our friends across the pond, Jack Rowlett. One of our great Young Voices contributors. He's a writer and commentary. He's all over the place. Great talking to you. Before we get you back again, let folks know where they can keep up with you, what you got going on, and how they can follow you until we talk to you again on Heard Tell, my friend.
So you can find me on Twitter at Jack_nostalgic, and you can find all my articles there, all my latest writing, latest appearances on British television and radio as well, and keep up to date with my thoughts on British and global politics.
Yep, there's a lot of stuff on housing, which is really important stuff to pay attention to, because I know we all got sick of infrastructure, but that's the infrastructure stuff that matters. Pay attention to it. Jack Rowlett, thank you so much for the time, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Welcome back to Heard Tell. She hadn't been here for a while. She's been very, very busy, but we're glad we got her down to start the new year off here on Heard Tell. Alys Watson-Brown, one of our favorites, Young Voices contributor, University of Bristol graduate. How are you, my friend?
I am very well, Andrew. I'm so happy to be back on the show. It has been too long, and I'm excited just for a good, light conversation about, what's most important and going on in the world.
Yeah, because there's nothing major going on there or
No,
here or in
it's kind of
England.
boring.
Hardly. I actually want to start right there because we talk to our UK friends all the time. It's been a tumultuous year in the UK. Politics, different prime ministers, the cost of living crisis that doesn't look like it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. I think that's a fair way to put it. You're going to have sometime in the next year and a half, you're going to have another election. So who knows how that goes. But here's how I want to ask this, because there's no way. Let's even back up a couple years to the Brexit stuff. Your generational cohort, that 20 to 30-year-old group, the part that just went through college, they graduated school about the time Brexit happened. Now they're coming out of college in the middle of this cost of living crisis. There's no way that's not having a cultural and political shift on your generation, is there?
Absolutely not. As a young person, so I'm 22. I graduated a few months ago. So I was 16 when Brexit happened, and then that was sort of my formative political experience, I guess. And I kind of just remember 2010 with the coalition and how that was shock horror. And then it was just sort of, when I came to my political maturity, it just seemed to be, a historical event after historical event. And now, having gone through Brexit and COVID, and the impact that COVID especially has had on the economy, I would say that the economy is our biggest concern with young people. And culturally, that means none of us are moving out. None of us can afford to really buy a house in the short term, even though interest rates are quite stable. The prices, they're just too high. So it's not fun at the moment, unless you're a very lucky person and you do manage to fall onto that dream grad job and get your sort of 60K a year. You're balling, you're doing great. But I guess, and I look back on my education as a sort of the class of COVID. I wasn't sort of in the midst of it, but I lost 18 months of university. And I think, what was it all for? I went through schooling. I abided to their standardized testing. In a very competitive atmosphere. I was lucky enough I went to one of the top schools in the country, a boarding school, and then a pretty, respectable university. I had a very lucky educational upbringing. And where am I at the moment? Without sounding too existential, I have no prospect of moving out. I'm struggling to get a job. My elder siblings haven't yet moved out. And pretty much everyone I know is in the same situation. And the government is not doing anything to help us, apart from just, their main focus is the NHS. They can't pin their workers down. They can't pin rail strikes. We're just being thrusted by all these things. That means we are being swept under the net. Aside from the fact that we're expected to be caught up in these culture wars and be on either side of something the whole time. One side of an argument, we're either woke or anti-woke, left or right, pro-trans, anti-trans, all of that. It's sort of, I don't want to complain too much, but it is kind of exhausting. But yeah, I think at the moment, my main worry, and the conversations you have with your friends when you go to the pub after a day of work or not work or whatever, that's all you talk about, is how poor you are and how much you want to move out. And as much as we love our parents, we're old. We're too old to be living with them. And it doesn't feel like there's going to be any future respite for that, apart from just keeping on going.
Yeah, Alys Watson-Brown joining us. That's the part I'm driving at, because I can go back. I'm a little bit older than you, not much. I can go back. We can look at the recession of the 2008 to 2009s. We can go back to the late 90s. There's political change when there's economic turmoil, especially to young folks, because it hits them differently. I noticed in my own children, my younger children that were in high school, primary school for y'all, those later grades, it really changed how they saw education. They didn't see school as something they go and do anymore. They really saw it as a government institution, because it got shut down and took away from them for 15 months, or at least my kids did. It completely changed how they saw education. They see school as a government entity now. That's going to change how they see the rest of their lives. So for your cohort, COVID is unique because it's not just you, it's so many people. That's going to change how you see government. It's going to change how you see politics. It sees how you change how you see economics. the folks that are arguing the political stuff in the UK, I really wonder how much it's hitting the next generation, because in 10 years, when y'all are the dominant force, you're going to cross a lot of those old traditional lines. The old playbook isn't really going to fit you all that well, is it?
No, I agree. And I think it's good to hear that, from your own children, that they saw it as a government institution. It was as much of a chore as paying taxes, if that makes sense. And I can't remember who wrote it. I think it was Joseph Piper. He said that in, not verbatim, but education and leisure are one. I think the origin of the word school, there was creativity and fun in that original meaning of the word. And there isn't anymore. And there wasn't. It was just kind of like, oh yeah, you're allowed to be here now, so you better do really well, and we're going to examine you in the exact same way before, you had your classrooms taken away from you and you had your in-person time taken away from you, and you can't complain. What are you on about? And you're still going to be expected to adhere to the same standards as always people before you. And that is just quite hard to come to grips with, because you always have a certain sense of trust to those people who mentor you academically and those who teach you. I always did. And that was sort of taken away. I didn't end up really respecting the people, the institutions all that much, which is bad. I don't want to feel like that, but it's true.
Yeah. That quote makes me think of the Robin Williams quote where he's explained politics. He said poly, from the Latin word for many, and ticks, meaning blood-sucking parasite. But, when you're coming out of, the education, whether it's there or America, education up through college, it's a system, it's a conveyor belt. You're expected, okay, go through all these steps. You mentioned it earlier, like, look, we did all that. I heard this from my own child. I did everything right. I did all the steps they told me to do. They didn't hold up their end. Like, that really is like a primal thing that changes. That's also a dangerous thing, because now you're not talking about a policy change. You're talking about people that have built-in resentment now. And I don't think you're just going to be able to policy change that away.
No, it's creating a general consensus of revolutionary politics, I suppose, rather than reactionary, and about what can we conserve that was good for us, for our children, than us just feeling like we need to tip this over and just start again because it's just useless. And whilst I do kind of think that in the UK, especially, our way of examining people, and this was before COVID, to be fair, our examination systems, I think, was flawed hugely. But these people, even they did everything right, as you say, they followed their steps. And some of them, poor people, weren't even allowed to take the exams that they were promised to show what they could do. They just said, oh no, like, people are too ill, you can't show up to take your test, which will actually define where you go to college, where you go for the rest of your life, what you can study. And that's awful. That is one entire trench of influence of your life just taken away from you, and that is completely out of your control, and that's not fair. And especially was the reason why I wanted to bring up the essay bot, the sort of AI. It's that if this whole thing comes in the context that literacy rates in the UK and the US are shocking at the moment. I think it's something like in the UK, I think 3/4 of white boys fail to meet the literary standards in the UK. And I think something in the US, it's like around 54% of adults fall below 6th grade literacy rates, which is A, costly to the economy, and B, what are we doing to our children? Why are we not worrying about this and instead letting them watch porn the entire time and making them think that that's real? Why are we not encouraging them to write stories, to play with Lego, to build things, and why are we bothered about how they identify, about their outward expression rather than their inward monologue with themselves, and how they teach themselves how to make mistakes gracefully, or however Jordan Peterson puts it? But it's, to me, so wrong. And now there's this whole thing where you don't even need to work to write your essays. It's this new story, I think, that came out. It's this bot called Chat GPT. And it can write pretty coherent mid-grade essays for you for free. You don't even need to pay for it. And I think the Daily Telegraph, actually, they paid a teacher to mark an essay written by this bot. And they said, it wasn't sophisticated, but it was very coherent. And this tech is only going to get more advanced. And whilst I'm not against, ed tech, it's a huge market in the UK, as I'm sure it is in the US, and how it helps, you know, people all across the world get a better education with more resources. This is why aren't people concerned about this alongside all these other trends? And I think it has been lost, it has been suffocated alongside all the other parts of the culture war. But this is going to be our greatest casualty, and we're not going to notice it for a long time. But when we do, we'll have no one but ourselves to blame.
Yeah, Alys Watson-Brown joining us. It links to that literacy thing you just said, because we've got the data on the COVID stuff in the US. I don't know about the UK numbers. In the US, the thing that got hurt the most was math and reading. Some of these kids are 2 years behind on reading now, and we have further data. We covered it on the show a couple weeks ago. Early literacy programs are the one thing that, yeah, they're expensive. Yes, we sink a lot of money into them, but it's also one of the few things that we actually got data that it works really well. Early literacy, that's one of the things that carries through. The problem with this is, in the U.S. education system, is we've lost literacy, not because we don't teach reading, but the entire of the education system is built towards standardized testing. We're teaching kids how to take a test instead of teaching kids how to learn, and it kills their literacy. So the reason that literacy piece and that bot piece you're just talking about, where look, the bot, that technology has a lot of good to it. People with disabilities, people working in second and third languages, people trying to get, you think of people that are nonverbal that could maybe use that and open their world up. That has a lot of good things. But when you start tempting something like that to people who have not been correctly educated, and they know they've got to pass these essays and these tests, that's a bad combination. And it's just rife for abuse, and it's just going to further hurt the education system.
It's going to hurt the education system and the pupils who they claim to serve. And what do we have to do with that? These people are going to hopefully be leading this country, but our countries, the world. And, people, do you really want a kid who said, oh yeah, I didn't actually write any of my essays? When it comes to the learning how to write and the learning how to read, this should be a common currency across the world, and we're losing that. That was the main thing, how we measured, women's rights and women's education, was how many people can read and how many people can write and how many people can do maths. Where is that? Where's that gone? But yeah, and going back to the sort of post-COVID factor about literacy rates being behind, there are pockets of students in the UK who just haven't returned to school. They're missing. I don't have the exact figures, and I don't want to chuck one out of thin air, but it's concerning. And that has cropped up in mainly kind of right-leaning media outlets over the last few months. But I don't know if it's the same in the US, but this is worrying. And these children are from vulnerable households, from abusive parents, low income mainly. In the UK, it's mainly concentrated in the northern regions. And some left-wing papers have blamed that on Brexit, which I find nonsensical. I couldn't really see a coherent link between their arguments. But it's no coincidence that if you don't tell kids to come to school, they won't do it. Made to just write essays like a machine and not actually getting any feedback.
That's universal. Kids don't want to go to school unless you make them. Alys Watson-Brown joining us. It's the same here. Look, the stats were bad. When you start talking about disparaged people groups, minorities, lower income, you go, the stats get worse. I mean, it's just inarguably. Those are the people that got left behind, because the people with means found way, they could get tutors, they could link up. I know in my home state of West Virginia, they had to put Wi-Fi rigs in buses and run them up and down the hollers and park them at a Walmart, and then everybody would go to the Walmart to the bus to get on Wi-Fi because there's not enough broadband. You start talking about issues like that. We talk about education, especially in America. I don't know how it is in England. Basically, like, if we just write enough money and we make the system big enough, it's going to fix itself. And we know that's not the truth because of the things you're just saying. And when I worked in the corporate world, it was starting to get like this, and now it's really getting like this. We have all these college degreed people, but they're having trouble getting jobs because everybody's got a college degree now that are the same, and they don't have a real skill set that sets them apart anymore. And I worry that what's just happened in the UK, you're going to start having that same problem there with the way the testing and the way y'all do the test outs or whatever you call them. I forget the term. The way y'all do that now, when you do that COVID scrunch of putting everybody together, you're going to have the same problem. All those people are in the same bucket fighting for a lesser and lesser jobs that are out there. This is a real problem, and it's a call to reevaluate how we're doing education, but we're not looking at it that way. We're just looking at it as a political problem.
I agree. And it shouldn't be politicized. And I think when you were saying, mentioning hard, skills, like hard skills, I don't think that we're being taught hard skills in school. We're not being taught. I think what's valuable now is being taught how to set up a drop shipping business so you can make money alongside, uni, or so you can fund your studies, or you can fund a 3-week course in how to code Python. That's going to make you instantly more employable. How can I fund my own shop on Shopify so I can at least learn how to sell? I can learn how to talk to people, and I can learn how to sell, and I can learn how to negotiate, and I can learn how to walk back with more money in my pocket. Those are the kind of things that I think some people are encouraging, that like self-reliance and entrepreneurship. I think that's really important. But the fact that it's our only option now, really, to make ourselves feel fulfilled is sad. Yeah, I think there are now a lot of courses online that are teaching you how to, how you can become a dropshipping master or a Forex trader in 2 weeks and things like that. There are more and more scams online, of course, these sort of get rich quick at home. But a lot of people are doing that. A lot of my friends, are nomads now. And they're enjoying it, don't get me wrong, but these are people who, from the schools they went to and the grades they got, you would expect would be flying high without any effort.
Yeah, Alys Watson-Brown joining us. That's something I wonder about too, is you just mentioned it. Normally, the folks that go to the better schools and do the certain career paths, they're expected to go into high finance, big business, politics, civil service, whatever. Is there going to be a brain drain in the UK from this? Because I think in the COVID area in America, with the way the government's going and some of those things, I think we're seeing a bit of a brain drain in government and politics, because a lot of the quote unquote good people don't want to fool with the mess. And that's always kind of been a joke, but I think we got some data to back it up now. Is that a fear in the UK with all the chaos? And now, like you just said, they're having these nomad things. They may go find something that they really like to do that is not that traditional career path. That's going to be a brain drain on not only government and civil service over there, but the country as a whole.
I agree. I think you sort of touched on the phrase. It's like the best people don't go into politics. I don't know who said that, but it's something that's, I say to a lot of people. There is no viable alternative, really. There's no viable political future for the UK. Even when, Boris Johnson was going out of office, we were like, oh, Liz Truss come along. But there was no kind of one person we were like, it's 3-0 down and we've got 2 minutes to go. We're going to get him in or her in. There was no one person who was the forerunner of this. And a lot of people say to me like, oh, why don't you go into politics? Like, obviously you'd love to go. And I was like, I'm just as bad as a lot of other people who just say, I don't want to touch that. I don't want to do it because I don't know how much change you would make. And B, I can't be bothered for the optics, the hate that's going to come just for trying. The sort of the echo chamber that you have to engage with now of social media if you want to put your name out there. And that, I guess that comes with the job, but I don't know. It's I hope it's not right. But when you were talking about the civil service in the UK, interestingly, because we've now realized that we have such a bloated bureaucracy, we're just creating jobs and throwing money at it. Like you said about the US education system, hoping that would solve things. People have now caught on that isn't the way, and they're slashing positions in the civil service at the moment. But that's not the way with other state institutions like the NHS. Interestingly, a lot of my friends who have landed graduate jobs are in the health service management schemes, not in the civil service, not in GCHQ, or any other kind of like traditional sort of high-flying occupation.
Alys Watson-Brown joining us. It's a little different in the UK than here, but there's a common theme I'm hearing, and I see it in your look. I watch PMQs just about every Wednesday. I'm pretty up on the UK politics, but I see a common theme there that's here. There just seems to be a lot of frustration without any outlet for it, and I don't want to get doomsaying about it. But the UK's got some real issues, and we've got some real issues here. We've got a couple of years, the next 2 years, and then this next election cycle in the US. This is going to be very contentious because we got a divided Congress. We got a presidential election coming. This is going to be some ugly stuff for a while. The UK looks like usually you have these pretty stable premierships where you get 3, 4, 5, 6-year runs. That's not going to happen. It doesn't look like Sunak's going to get too far into next year without having to have some kind of an election. That'll be 4 in about 18 months, give or take. Let's just ballpark it. That's not normal instability for the UK. How does that land with the people, though? I know at the end of the Brexit, it was just, okay, it's over. We almost don't even care which way. Just make it go away, right? Is it getting to be that way with Parliament and the premiership right now? Because it feels like from the outside, folks are just kind of sick of this rut that the Parliament and the Prime Minister and the revolving door are in right now.
I think so. It's a rut of epic proportions, I would say. I think the trail of leadership since Boris Johnson, so you had Liz Truss, who tried to be radical, but the one rule about being radical is that you have to be reassuring in order to succeed. And she wasn't reassuring. It was a bulldozing, blundering, trying to be Margaret Thatcher kind of performance caricature, which failed, obviously. And then you have Rishi Sunak. He's quieter, more reassuring, but fluffy, no personality, sort of disliked by a lot of the conservative grassroots because of his role in COVID and lockdown. In essence, the Conservative Party now has fallen into the trap of its Labour counterpart and that it doesn't know what it stands for. I spoke about the Labour problem, I think, in the last podcast, but I think their main identity crisis now is over taxation. Are you a party of high taxation or low tax? It's not a difficult question to answer. And because they created the mess in which they had to raise taxes, they are now at an utter loss at which string to grasp to pull themselves forwards. It's fascinating to watch, albeit depressing. It's fascinating. And there's now sort of on the edge, there's the tension of, is Nigel Farage going to return to politics? Is he going to make this grand re-entry for, leave the GB News studio and come in and save everyone? A lot of Tory MPs are scared they'll lose their seats if he does. But I have no faith in that really ensuing anything different either. It'll just be new crisis, different day.
Yeah, I don't know that gasoline on the fire is what's called for here. I don't know if that's a British saying or not, but it certainly is where I am. That will be one hot mess. But unfortunately, here's the problem. And again, we're not even talking specific politics here. We're just talking big picture here. People get sick of it. People have bandwidth. People can only take so much, even with parties they agree with and ideologies they agree with. That's when you really have trouble, though, is when people start tuning out and they just start going, just make it stop and go away. That's when the really bad, ugly stuff happens. And that's why we need to be vigilant, both in the UK with whatever happens in your next election and us with what's going to be happening here. That's when you really got to be vigilant, because when people are going, no, 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 just make it stop, that's when the untoward actors start really working their stuff and be like, oh, I'll make it all better. Listen to me. This is the time we got to really hold on to our principles and pay attention to what's going on, even more so, as hard as it is.
I agree. That's the time when accountability goes out the window and populism becomes your best friend. It's, as you say, pouring fuel on the fire. I have no idea what really will ensue in the next general election in the UK. I imagine the Conservatives will lose their majority. Whether that means they are not going to be the largest party is a different question. I have a feeling they will remain the largest party because Labour have not yet made a stand that has made them attractive to Conservative voters who can cross enemy lines, in my opinion. But I don't know. The problem is that I think I was reading US news today as well, that as well the politicians seem to be fighting between themselves more than their more than the public. And that seems to me wrong. It should be the other way around. I think wasn't it so the Republicans are taking back the House, and now they want to launch an inquiry on Joe Biden and COVID, about Hunter Biden's laptop. And you think, obviously these are, these could be pretty big wedge issues, but it seems to me that rather than, as soon as the other side gets in, rather than building and carving their own future for that, for their beliefs, they're just trying to make it look like the guy before them did a worse job than they're going to do. What kind of a system is that? It's not appealing, it's not attractive, and it's discouraging any attractive talent from joining you. And it's it's not durable.
No, and they better, Alys Watson Brown join us. They better do some I've been writing about this, and even really hardcore folks on the right that really understand it are like, no, you better do some governing, because remember, our Congress, you're up every 2 years. We could have this really absurd thing where we flip the Senate and the Congress both right back again in 2 years. Be interesting to watch. Alys Watson Brown. I love talking these bigger picture cultural stuff because it's important, because this is the stuff that, like we're talking about the generational cohorts. And this is stuff in 10 years, people are going to be like, oh, how did this get this way? And we can go back and go like, look, we were already talking about it. So it's good to talk to you about these things. We always enjoy having you back on the program. We will have you back on the program in 2023, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise. That's another American saying. We don't know if y'all need to adopt that one too.
Probably.
Let folks know where they can follow you and keep up with you. You can even pitch your Spotify account if you want to. I know you're all into the fashion stuff. Let folks know where they can keep up with you till we get you back on Heard Tell again.
Yeah, so my Twitter handle is just at Alys Watson Brown. No, ALYS Watson Brown. I will be posting more there occasionally now. I have been radio silent, probably because I'm losing faith, which is bad. So we're going to keep our principles and we're going to keep investing. But thank you so much for having me on. It's been such a pleasure, and I really hope to see you soon.
I do too. That's why we do Twitter Supper Club, though. Put the food on there. Let's get our faith in humanity back in there. Alys Watson Brown, you're great, my friend. Talk to you soon. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, and you too.
All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.